gentlemen, both in presence here at Holding Redlick and also online tonight for our very interesting discussion led by Griffith Asia Institute on 6 issues to unlock Asia Pacific's global leadership. My name is Paul Lucas. I'm the State President of the AIIA and welcome here tonight. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand tonight, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge sovereignty if never ceded. Can I also acknowledge some very welcome visitors tonight, my former ministerial colleague, Dr. Rod Welford. Great to see you here, Rod. Dr. Wan, the Chinese Consul General, always welcome and always a great and engaging speaker when he's here. And also Emeritus Professor Colin McCurris, great to see you here, great in Asian Studies. Without further ado, you're not here to listen to me, so I'll call on the newish Director of Griffith Asia, Professor Christoph Nedderpil, to introduce our speakers, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions later. Can I also ask anyone online if you could make sure you mute your computer while you're listening?
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks for co-hosting the Institute of International Affairs. Thanks to Holding Redlick for welcoming us here. It's great to be back after, I think, 2 months back on this stage here. It's really fantastic to have this opportunity to present a work that we've been, as a team, working on over the last 6 months, to really try to understand what are some of the strategic issues that drive and can really unlock sustainable development leadership of Asia and the Pacific. So we set out 6 months ago to answer the big question: what does it take to make Asia Pacific, including Australia, the global leader in sustainable development? We always kind of hear about Europe, the US, and sometimes about China, and actually Asia Pacific is where most of the global growth, economic growth, population growth is taking place. Now, Asia Pacific also has this fantastic opportunity to be a technological leader in many of the green technologies. And so we asked ourselves, it's very complex, and we brought together 24 authors from about 10 institutions. We put some here, including the Asian Development Bank Institute, Climate Smart Ventures, a couple of other universities, to answer these big questions. And we came up with 6 themes that we believe are most crucial to understand what it takes to unlock sustainable development in Asia, to really supercharge it. And I could not be more excited than to really have some of the leading experts, particularly from the Griffith University, but actually also some internationally leading experts, who have taken on the leadership in addressing some of these big questions. And the themes that we identified, and it was actually a lot of work to really try even to identify what are the main themes. The themes that we had is green and just transition. I think it goes without saying that climate change and biodiversity loss are some of the most pressing issues that we face in our times. At the same time, the question is, how can we make a just transition to a greener economy? And Rob Hales will introduce this chapter. The second question is the Pacific. And the Pacific, particularly for Australia, is in a very interesting neighborhood, and I think everybody knows in this room the wonderful Tess Newton-Cain, who will introduce the great work that has been happening here. The third big question that we try to answer is China and the region. Really excited for Lily Mead to introduce kind of the great work that we've been doing here. The fourth big question is, what is happening with a just, with kind of inclusive growth and kind of this just growth for everyone? Digital inclusion, digital financial inclusion. How can we ensure that nobody's left behind? And Sean Hunter has been working on this topic for years, and so I'm really excited for him to introduce that question. Andrea Hefner really big kind of thank you to her, because she's actually on maternity leave, and she really ensured that this chapter comes together and is also here today despite being on maternity leave. Really looking forward to the presentation. And finally, Mohammed Ali Hossain, he will be joining us online. He's from the International Labour Organization, talking about the question of confronting labour market challenges. And I want to just highlight the 4 themes that we identified throughout this. The main challenge that we will have to address is to build trust. And I guess many of you have seen last week a new study released, a new data released by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, that for the first time put China as the most trusted partner in the region. There is really a question of trust issues, trust challenges that we're seeing that have to be addressed in order to really collaborate, because without trust, we cannot collaborate. The second big question, the big ask is we have to expand our China knowledge. And China is the indispensable partner across all of these questions. And there's a lot of, I think, conflicting views on China, which we, I think, have to acknowledge, but we have to understand China better. We have to expand our China knowledge. Identify and focus on shared issues. And this is really important in order to reduce the frictions and focus the resources that we have. There are only limited resources. What are the main issues that we want to focus on? And creating inclusive opportunities so we're not leaving anyone behind. With that, I'm really excited to welcome Rob to the stage to introduce about the Asia Green Just Transition Opportunity. Thank you. There's such a thing.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here and talk about this. I was thinking, what would be different now compared to, say, 10 years ago if I was giving the same talk? I mean, would the just transition topics that I'm talking about tonight be the same? And I think it's actually changed. There's a slight shift, I think, and significant shift happening across the world. And Asia is no different to other parts of the world. So I've been proud to say I've been involved in this and other authors. I'd just like to acknowledge Lauren Sang, Managing Director of Climate Smart Ventures from Singapore, Fabi Tuwima, Managing Director of Institute of Essential Services and Reform. So we put our heads together and thought, with the help of surveying the literature, as well as a little bit of AI help as well, to be able to see what's out there, and using our experts at Griffith University as well. And we came up with challenges, but also opportunities. So, good. So why a just transition in the first place? We have a business risk. The problem here is that a lot of us have seen what's happening in companies in terms of fiduciary duty of, and also here in Australia, we've got legislation sitting in Parliament at the moment, federal level, related to climate change, even though it's billed as a Sustainability Act. So things are moving here in Australia, and they're having ripple effects throughout the world as well, coming from Europe and America. Just transition, a lot of talk about this. We have to really struggle to find great case studies throughout the world here, but there are some good ones. Nature positive, a lot of nature positive talk happening at the moment. It justifies why we should think about a green transition and including people within that. Investment, to actually meet mitigation targets, we're looking to, we need to triple the amount that we're currently committing in terms of mitigation and adaptation efforts. And also, because of the role of state-owned enterprises in energy in Asia, and also particularly in Australia, so we have a reason why we should be thinking about a just transition when we think about green transition. Now, this is a map which is a little bit different to the one that's in the document, but I wanted to include Australia because usually in the past we've had Australia not necessarily in the green book there, in the green books. We're usually not having the right commitments, but I can I'm proud to say that we our commitments have increased in terms of pledges. And this is a two-part presentation here. We've got a map and it shows the nations that have got a pledge and the ones that don't have a pledge. And you can see that there are some countries that still are looking for their pledges for net zero emissions by 2050. Now, there's one blue dot there, which is Bhutan, that actually has achieved it, self-proclaimed that it achieved net zero emissions. Yes, so we can see that there is some large commitment. Now, if there is going to be this commitment, there are massive challenges with the commitments that the countries are making here. And some of the challenges we've outlined in the document speak to those. But the biggest challenge we feel really in terms of that just transition is the coal issue. So that's why we focused on that. In terms of recommendations, we have a number of recommendations here. State-owned enterprises transitioning. There are some great examples out there. You can look to Singapore to see what mechanisms are in place to look at high integrity carbon offsets to decommission coal-fired power stations. So that's quite an amazing initiative that's happening. We've got just transition. There's typically you look elsewhere, but there are a couple of interesting things happening in Vietnam in terms of, South Korea, in terms of their unions getting behind a just transition. So some great work happening there. We've seen the green taxonomies happen, guiding investment throughout Asia, and that's pretty important. That's very important. In Queensland, for example, talking to Treasury officials here, it was really great to see the sustainability report of Queensland get shifted into Treasury. And I was talking to the people in Treasury, the reasons why they said that they had to do that was because there were some problems with green bond issuance and sustainability. So that was, we've got examples in Queensland here where the importance of taxonomies are quite important here. Smart business, eco-efficiency is very, very important, but also the ripple effect of Scope 3 emissions throughout the ecosystems of business is going to have a massive effect, and Asia is experiencing that as well. And biodiversity, because it underpins so much of the growth in Southeast Asia, we can't forget that. So there are our key recommendations, and I'm over time. So thank you so much.
My name is Tess Newton-Kane. For those of you who don't know me, I arrived from San Francisco, flew overnight and arrived this morning. So all bets are off in terms of how coherent this is going to be. I would draw your attention to my co-author for this chapter, Anna Nauper. Anna is a leading thinker in the Pacific Islands region. She has huge amounts of experience with regional organisations, and it was great to be able to work with her again. And when she's Prime Minister of Vanuatu, I'll be able to say that we So what are we looking at in terms of the Pacific? So in the first part of our paper, what we've done is we've looked at what's going on in the world and what do we think that means for the Pacific. We've identified three major winds or trends or effects that are going to have a particular impact in the Pacific. So obviously they affect everybody, but what we've tried to do is really drill down into what these three things mean in our region, in the Pacific Islands region. Shaky economic prospects, including a continuing long tail from recovery from COVID, and obviously exacerbated by major climate events. The climate challenge, so not just climate events, but also the ongoing challenge around maintaining a regional collective, securing appropriate funding for both mitigation and adaptation, and geopolitical shifts, the impacts on Pacific regionalism and national sovereignties. And obviously, all of these things intersect, they don't stand alone. We look at how they come together and what that means for the next 12 to 24 months in the Pacific. So in order to drive Pacific development gains and ensure that nothing is left to chance, what we've tried to do is we've identified these three underpinning platforms for activity in the region: deepening Pacific regional resolve, safeguarding Pacific democratic cultures, and proactively leveraging Pacific agency. And then we've overlaid those with the three trends that we identified previously. So what needs to happen in relation where these things intersect. So for example, COP31 bid outcomes to advance the Blue Pacific's higher ambition on climate action. So this is an area where the issue around maintaining regional resolve intersects with addressing the climate change. And in terms of addressing democracy, we've identified that there's a need for targeted efforts to promote and safeguard human rights for all Pacific peoples via regional partnerships. All of these things are explored in a lot more detail in the paper, including with some examples that we've identified from around the region as to where we think these tensions are arising and what that means in terms of taking forward development for the whole region. In terms of the geopolitics, obviously bilateral forums, summitries with partners to maximise the value of development support on Pacific priorities. We know that the Pacific and Pacific Island countries are increasingly on the receiving end of a whole lot of bilateral engagement, development, diplomacy, defence diplomacy, all of these things. But what we're concerned about and what we try and pull out of this paper is how can these be best maximised to support Pacific priorities for the development of their own countries. And you know, we've seen even just recently in the news in the last day or so that these issues are ongoing. They're not new for 2024. Some of them we think are going to probably ramp up. So we have three sets of key recommendations. Within each set, there's a pair. We have recommendations for the leaders of the Pacific leadership, and we have recommendations that are directed towards Pacific partners, including Australia, the US, China, and all the others. We've deliberately kept these very kind of high level, and we've deliberately focused on not so much of the what. So it's not a laundry list or a shopping list of what to do in the Pacific and what to do with the Pacific. It's very much focused on the how and the why. So why are these things important in the Pacific, and how can they be done in ways that are most beneficial for... Thank you.
Then you want to read one.
Hi everyone, it's really a great honor to be here to present the work we have done with my co-author Christoph, who have led the work, and also Dr. Chen Gang from East Asia Institute at National University of Singapore. So our work is on engaging China for sustainable development in Asian countries. So the first question we want to ask is why we engage in China. And the reason is really simple, because China is everywhere in Asian countries for all various reasons. First is economic influence. Although we see the international trade have actually fell in 2023, but China still remains the #1 trading partners for more than 200 countries in the world. And also, of course, many of them are in Asian countries, including Japan, South Korea, and of course, Australia as well. So we cannot ignore the economic influence of China. And in addition to the volume, we also see the quality of China's international trade has actually climbed up the value chain, especially when we look at China is transforming from a manufacturing powerhouse to an innovation powerhouse, and also from the OEM to ODM and also OPM as well. So when we are looking at China's outward foreign direct investment, in another report also, Christoph and I, we worked together, we actually predicted that there's a growing demand in green transition. So we predict that actually there will be a growing investment in the green transition areas in China, especially when we see 5.2% of China's growth in GDP actually was driven by the three new industry areas into green transition, and also battery and also renewable energy as well. So we can see that China is really influential in growing its transition into renewable energy. In addition to that, we also see a growing diplomatic power from China as well. And as a Chinese citizen living in Australia, I feel there's a lot of different interpretations of how we understand China. And whether we see China as actually making a huge contribution to the world economy, or well, some of the Western powers will understand China actually trying to weaponize, you know, the trade relations, and also trying to influence or growing more dependency on China. So there's really different interpretations of how we understand the role of China in the world economy. But what we understand is we really need to grow the mutual trust, where, you know, Christoph have mentioned that, because for Asian Pacific countries, it's really key to work on economic collaboration with China and also the Western power. So in order to do that, we need a balanced view, rather than thinking of how we should disengage with China. We should actually growing more engagement with China. And that actually leads to all these main challenges that we are facing in the region. Now here I'm going to throw the thunder from Rob and also Tess as well for the climate change and also biodiversity losses in the Asia Pacific region, especially in the Pacific Island nations, and also the digital transformation, which my colleague Sean will talk a lot about it. But here we really want to look at, in addition to inclusiveness, but also the corporate digital responsibility as well, in terms of ethical and also good use of data as well. And also we are facing some issues in trade and security, where we see there are some territorial conflicts between nations in this region as well. So overall, what we propose is really, instead of diversifying, decoupling, or deferring China, what we want to look at for the growth of economy in Asia Pacific is to engage with China in new economies such as green energy and green transition and green finance as well, through non-dependence and also mutual respect. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Sure, it's me. Yep, it's me. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a really great pleasure to be here. This is my third presentation for the day, so I hope that I don't get my topics mixed up. What we did on the inclusive growth and development agenda as part of this report, we worked very closely with our colleagues at the Asian Development Bank Institute, which gave us a bit more reach in terms of tapping into regional experts on different issues. And we looked at several different specific themes. So we looked at financial inclusion, we looked at digital inclusion, we looked at women's economic empowerment, the role of green finance and development. We even looked at what it means for new technologies like artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact the development practice going forward. So within each of these topics, we had lots of insights and lots of recommendations, but obviously in my 5 minutes, I'm not going to be able to go through all of that. So what I did for this presentation is to try to look at capturing the sort of essence of all of these different papers that were included as part of the report, and look at what are the main sort of takeaways in terms of the bigger picture. What does it mean in terms of how should we be pursuing inclusive economic growth in the region? So obviously a little background. So the Asia Pacific region, as I'm sure we're all aware, has really benefited a lot from relatively strong economic growth over the last decade or so. And but despite all of that, we still have over 150 million people in the region who are suffering from extreme poverty. So these are big numbers. Income and wealth inequality is one of the biggest issues that we're trying to grapple with in the region. And so how do we address that? And so what we looked at, in terms of one of the main takeaways is we need to move away from this inclusive growth mindset, which is, if you look at the they're familiar with the old adage, a rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing. Because the problem with that is if we're looking at including everybody into that economic growth spectrum, then sure, everybody goes up, but the rich go up and the poor also go up, but everyone stays the same relatively. So what we want to do is move to this inclusive and equitable growth mindset, where not only are the rich, and those who are already prospering go up, but the poor have a better advantage and are advancing at a higher rate to try to equalize that growth. So it's not just the rich getting richer and the poor staying relatively poor. So just to demonstrate that a little bit, this is some data more recently from the World Bank. And so you can see that in Asia, the top 10% in terms of the wealthiest group of people still control over 50% of the wealth in the region. And while that may be better than other regions, that's still quite a lot. But perhaps what's more concerning is when we look at the right side, what we can see is that the bottom 50%, so the poorest groups, the poorest 10% or so, the poorest 50% control about 10% of the wealth in the region. And so, particularly since the year 2000, that trend has been going down, which essentially means two things. One, we've got a growing middle class, which is good, but also that the poor are getting poorer. So this inequality is actually growing. And that whether it's a digital divide or other sort of divides that are occurring there, that's what we want to address. How do we get that trend to go the other way? So we came up with three general recommendations here. So the first is to give the poor and vulnerable the upper hand. So it's one thing to have policies that sort of support economic growth and support everybody equally, but we need to look at more of these policies that actually promote growth at the level of the poor. So who are the most vulnerable in our society, whether it's micro enterprises, women or youth or disabled? What are the policies that we can do to target these most disadvantaged people and give them that upper hand, to give them advantages so that they can get their fair share of the wealth? And things like promoting, cooperatives or labor unions, the things that enhance these social protections can have a big impact there. The next is to enhance resilience through new economic models. So when we're dealing with people who have limited income, they have a much higher increased reliance on community or government support. And so in the face of climate change, this is actually getting worse because these people are now combating, increased shocks from the increased severity and frequency of climate events. So having these people continue to rely on this government and community support is problematic, but it's also part of the solution here. So we need to look at how can we actually increase these social safety nets in ways that give them that better advantage and they can deal with these shocks more effectively. And then lastly, embracing innovation but understanding its limits. So understanding that technology isn't a silver bullet. And particularly when we're talking about the disadvantaged, if a government is going to promote something like AI, for example, as a development tool, how do we ensure that that doesn't disadvantage people who may not have the capabilities or skills to actually work in that sort of technology? So, happy reading. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be talking about Southeast Asia, particularly the key challenges, opportunities, and some recommendations. I also want to thank Dr. Sobinder Kaur, who was co-authoring the paper with me. He's the director of the Southeast Asia Center at the Royal University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Southeast Asia is really a dynamic and diverse region comprising the 10 countries of ASEAN, mainly due to its geopolitical, economic, and cultural importance beyond the region, particularly because of its strategic location, economic potential, and cultural values. And I think there's four main reasons for that. There's the central maritime position vital for global trade routes, but also ASEAN being the third largest economy in Asia and the fifth largest globally, but also rapid economic growth and expanding middle class with a combined population of over 650 million people and a rising middle class. So clearly potential there as well. But having said that, ASEAN as a bloc, while there's criticism and controversy, as an economic power, it has been more and more established. And so it's really an emerging, crucial regional bloc. which hasn't been the case in the past. On the other side, in Southeast Asia, there still remain severe, both traditional and non-traditional security challenges and risks. And in the chapter, we're going to talk about 5 key challenges. I'm not being able to cover all today because we have limited time, but one of them is geopolitics and foreign policy, mainly focusing on South China Sea. I'm not going to cover that. Another one I'm not going to cover today as well is democratic backsliding and the rule of law. I'm going to focus on 3 other areas today. The first one I'm going to focus on is public health, particularly infectious diseases, which are really one of the most important public health challenges in Southeast Asia and Asia, I think, more broadly. And it's mainly driven by dense populations, rapid urbanization, and also environmental challenges. We heard already biodiversity loss and others. And it's really an impact conducive to the spread of various pathogens, including emergent viruses and also long-standing infectious disease. Most people think about COVID, obviously, but again, in Southeast Asia, there's other diseases like dengue fever, malaria, tuberculosis, Zika virus, and others in recent years that really play in case. And just to see how topical it is, there was an anthrax outbreak in Laos at the end of March, which, for example, in Thailand hasn't seen any anthrax cases for 24 years. So again, we can see, and it's around over 50 people have been impacted. Not a huge number, but we can see how other diseases that haven't been really present in the region are suddenly kind of rising up. And also the infectious diseases outbreak is firstly kills people, it increases the death annually. But what's also really important is it showcases the challenges in access to healthcare services and the inequality in the region, how the poor have less access to health systems. Hospitals in very remote or regional areas are not as advanced as in the capital cities or in urban centers. So again, this divide we heard before as well when Sean was talking about the gap in the healthcare system really impacting the reason of infectious diseases. And climate change and haze pollution, just to mention that haze pollution, as you would be aware, is a big issue, particularly in Malaysia, Singapore, but at the moment in Thailand and Laos, very dominant as well, the hottest time of the year. We don't focus much on that in the report, but clearly another public health issues, particularly long health impacts for children and young people. Climate change, we heard about it quite a few, but Southeast Asia has experienced one of the fastest speed of global warming, and it could increase, have dangerous levels already by 2030 onwards. And when we think about ASEAN, for example, looking at rice production, it's really impacted already now by the weather. For example, in the past, there have been prolonged rice planting seasons, both in Thailand and Vietnam, which we think is a national issue. But again, there's around 26% of the global rice comes from ASEAN. So clearly, it's not only an issue of the region or a country, it's beyond that. And the countries in ASEAN accounting for 40% of the total rice is for exports. Again, it's an income for the economies, while on the other side, exporting 26% to other parts. ASEAN has been doing some work on climate change. The ASEAN State of Climate Change report in 2021 highlighted some key aims, particularly mitigation and adaptation, to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. However, achieving net zero emissions is far from being materialized, and we heard the impact on coal in ASEAN, which still plays a big role. There's some focus on hydropower and other kind of more greener energies, but still there's challenges here. And the third area, which plays a big role in Southeast Asia, is digitalization. Like, it's really important in the rest of the Asia Pacific as well. But there's around 400 million digital users in Southeast Asia, contributing around 130 billion revenue in that space. And just some example, is that out of 1 more minute? 1 more minute, right? But just a quick example, for example, ASEAN is working on a standard QR code across the region using the Indonesian QR code. That's one initiative. And also that some banks have signed up corporations to work together where you can use, for example, a Lao person can buy in the local currency in Vietnam or Cambodia. Just the key recommendations, we cluster them in 3 areas. Collaboration, one example, more collaboration efforts are needed, for example, in the health surveillance and healthcare systems. It's a really important area. And similar technology development and information, particularly linked to security and efficiencies in digital transformation. It's great to have more people online, but again, it's about the governance of it and making it secure as well. And Sean was talking about that before. In regards to inclusiveness, we have a few examples in the report. One is strengthening freedom of speech and the rule of media. just so everyone has an opinion and there's more transparency, but also bridging the digital gap between the urban and the rural population I mentioned, particularly when we think about the healthcare systems, public health issues, but also digitalization, very different in urban areas than in remote rural areas. And financing predominantly in public health, including clinics and hospitals, for example, but also joint climate financing for the most vulnerable members in the communities within ASEAN and the ASEAN member countries. But there's a lot of more examples in the report. And as I mentioned, the other two topics, one is looking at the South China Sea and the other one at democratic backsliding. So thank you.
Thank you. So our final speaker is it Modavi or Yana Islam?
Modavi.
Okay. Are you there? And can you fire away? We'll do that. We'll attend to that. Just we'll make sure.
Yes, am I audible to the people? I mean, good evening, everyone.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, everyone, and I think I'm very happy to be part of this discussion today. I think on behalf of my co-author, Professor Yan, and myself, I would like to give a glimpse on our work on the labor market challenges in the perspective of SDGs in the South Asian countries. I think first we need to understand that why labor market matters in the South Asia, like the other countries and the regions. I think basically labor market is the driver of the economic growth as it provides the livelihoods and options for income for the people. And to be very frank, I think there is a debate that how the economy should work in a country. And the famous argument is that economy should work for the people, not the other way around. So I think that is why the labor market is a very important part. I think I will go about the top 3 challenges that we identified among the many challenges of our work. The first one is the informality. There is unprecedented informality in the South Asian countries, where informal sector is the dominant sector for labor market participation and workforce. I think on an average, 80% of the employment comes from the informal sectors in South Asian countries, which weekly establish a lot of the areas of labor market policies and employment policies and labor market institutions in the region that makes very difficult to improve the working condition and employment outcomes. And the second big challenge that we identified is the gender disparities in the region, because only 25% of the workforce we have from the female labor force participation in the region. So this is a very big untapped opportunity and economic loss for the region itself, which would have anyway contributed an increase of 58% per capita GDP growth if the women labor force and female labor force participation could be increased in this region to some calculations. And the third one, which is also very important, that we in this region, there are evidence that the youth and the skills of the youth are underutilized because on an average, more than 20% youth of the labor market in the South Asian countries are not in education, employment, or training. So these are called the niche population. And a big chunk of those at the end of the day of, after being out of the labor force, become discouraged and they eventually stop searching for jobs. So this is a big miss, and there is a big loss due to the less involvement of the youth in the labor market in terms of the overall GDP and economic growth of the region. Now, going towards the key 3 recommendations that we have identified for the region, the first one is obviously that there has to be, for the countries in this region, a comprehensive national employment policy backed up by the implementation, action, and a strategy, because many of the countries are developing and formulating the national employment policy, but those were in kind of isolation with the other development policies and the job strategy. So employment policy with a comprehensive integration should be the priority. And the second one is the robust labor market governance. So I think by the labor market governance, it has to be the stronger labor market institutions, labor administration, international labor standards, labor rights. It should be improved in the region overall, which are still very weak and vulnerable and fragile. And the third one is increasing the private sector and public investment to create jobs and through the structural transformation with support from the favorable confounding macroeconomic factors. So these are the three recommendations. So I think I'll stop here. And thank you everyone for patiently listening to me.
Well, I can tell you one thing for sure. We're certainly inviting Griffith Asia back here again. Not only were all the speakers on time, they're also delivered an incredibly incisive and punchy outlook. So clearly the Christoph Teutonic influence in terms of
Bavarian.
has worked.
For the experts.
So we might ask the panel if they could, the exception of Avi, who can't do it, if they could take a seat.
Can Avi turn his camera on?
Avi, can you turn your screen on, please, so people can see you?
Yeah, sure. Just a second. Can people see me? Because I have switched on my video.
We can't see.
No, we saw you earlier, but then we
Just put the screen back in front.
Okay. Let me check. Do you see me now?
No, we'll see how we go. The prerogative of the chair is to ask the first question. There are many similarities within Asia and within the Pacific in terms of climate and geography, but not always. In the Pacific, Melanesians, Polynesians, Micronesians, and some islands, volcanic, some islands, coral atolls. Similarly, Asia is so diverse but has similarities. Have we yet learnt in the West, and particularly in Australia, that whilst there are similarities in Asia, that is not only condescending but wrong to treat each Asian or Pacific country the same? And are we seeing policy outcomes yet that reflect that? Now, I don't know if we want all six of you to answer, but or unless it's very quick, but whoever would like to do that.
Well, I might lead off quickly with particular reference to the Pacific. I think not only you said that it's condescending, I think that's true, but I also think increasingly what we're seeing in the Pacific is that it is strategically inept to take this kind of cookie cutter Pacific approach. I think a failure to appreciate the historical differences, the cultural differences, and just the way of thinking and being in different Pacific Island countries is leading to some really quite strange outcomes at the policy level in Australia, but elsewhere as well, of course.
Anyone want to comment on it from an Asian focus?
With Southeast Asia, I think it's quite similar to the Pacific, right? There's mainland Southeast Asia is maybe more similar than some of the countries which have a lot of different islands. Clearly, like the Philippines and Indonesia would be more similar than, for example, more landlocked countries like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. But again, within them, there's huge differences as well, language-wise, religion-wise, politics-wise. There's a variety of regime types there. So I think while you're right, often ASEAN is seen as a bloc, has its advantages because it gives them one voice sometimes if they can agree on that. But on the other side, there's huge variation in between them. And I think it's very dangerous to trying to put them all in one pot.
Okay, audience questions. And we have two important rules. One, we take questions, not speeches. And two, we like questioners who aren't just old white blokes like me. We particularly encourage questions from younger members of the audience, in particular women. That's not to say old white blokes can't ask questions. So, who would like to ask the first question?
My question is directed at the speaker regarding China. You mentioned that there's an increase in trust towards China, which is very encouraging to hear. Oh, sorry, just, well, that's even better. My question is, what are the evident roadblocks that you can see regarding increasing that trust towards China? And how do we overcome some of those roadblocks, especially given how much they are a big player in those key industries like green tech, battery, and renewables? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's really good, because I haven't got the time to go through my recommendations. I think this is the time. We really need to grow the trust between China and also Asian countries, including the Western powers, in terms, in terms of creating an open, direct communication channel, and then also through diplomatic dialogues, which we are actually seeing it actually growing from the Australia-China relations in the recent years, and also from people-to-people engagement. I'm actually very proud to say that I'm leading actually a studying tours with more than 350 students from Hong Kong coming to Australia this year. So I think through this we can continue to grow the mutual trust between Australia and China and also Asian countries.
Thank you.
Just up. Just about inclusive growth. I just want to know, do you think it's going to be very difficult to bring in to these developing countries in the Asia Pacific stuff like the increasing the welfare state, increasing union participation, increasing wages, when even in developed countries like Australia over the recent decades, we've seen massive cutbacks in things like unions, wages, and welfare state?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that it's going to be challenging, but I think one of the things that we have to think about is we actually had a seminar just recently at Griffith where we had a speaker talking about this, and if you look at the sort of history of development, so much of it has been focused on trying to push this sort of market-based development approach where, in order to get the poor people to be less poor, we need to get them to engage in the market and essentially get them to lift themselves out of poverty. So that may work to some degree, but what we're seeing over and over is that doesn't really work. And to the earlier question around what the cultural and the difference, all of the differences between these different countries and how they operate, that solution doesn't